Nearly 7,000 years ago, the Stone Age peoples of Europe began to build stone monuments and ceremonial places in honor of their dead. By doing so, they initiated one of the most mysterious and fascinating periods of our prehistory, which was to develop 2,000 years, the megalithic period. It was here, along some of the most dramatic coasts of the Atlantic, that the world's oldest chamber tombs were to be built, in Ireland, in Brittany and France, and in Portugal, far from the well-established farming societies of Central Europe and the Mediterranean countries. Along windswept coasts and on barren islands, we find what is left of the Stone Age cultures, for which marine catches have always been of much greater importance than farming and cattle breeding. Yet it was here that the tradition of building the impressive stone monuments was to develop and flourish. People settled in Ireland for the first time almost 10,000 years ago. The Irish Sea was an open, flat land with a sound so narrow that people and animals could cross it from the continent. England was a part of the European continent, and the Channel and the North Sea were at the time dry land. The first humans who reached Green Island found large virgin forests, so the open landscape of today is a relatively modern phenomenon. The endless bogs, though characteristic of Ireland, didn't begin to form until during the colder and wetter climate of the early Iron Age, more than 2,000 years ago. The dense forests didn't appear until well into historic times. Echoes of the past may be heard more clearly in Ireland than in many other places in Europe. Everywhere in the undulating landscape, with its picture villages and thatched cottages, there are untouched ancient remains that can be read like an open book, from the Stone Age until the present day. And yet, we get the feeling that time has stood still. Abandoned farms and ruined houses characterize the landscape in many places. Timeless monuments of great famines of the 19th century with bad harvests and potato blights. Between 1845 and 1911, the population of the country was reduced by almost 50%, owing to mass starvation and emigration. The impressive round towers near many of Ireland's churches remind us of violent times much earlier in history, when they served as forts of refuge against the ravages of the Vikings in the 9th and 10th centuries. Many of the towers, still in good condition, stretch their conical stone roofs towards the sky, like this one at Kilmacduagh in Galway. The Irish tradition of erecting stone crosses is just as old, and the wheels of the crosses represent Christ's position in the middle of the cosmos.
Around my neck, and tears like rain did fall, and I tore out from her arms in
In Ireland, meet one of the most spectacular megalithic traditions along the European coast. Excavations have shown that the Emerald Isle is one of the places where the first chamber tombs in the world were built. But why just here? In Europe, the megalithic tradition reached its climax about 5,000 years ago, with famous and mysterious monuments such as Stonehenge in England, Newgrange in Ireland, and the Alignment in Brittany and France. Why this tradition came to an end has long been largely unknown. For a long time, the megalithic tombs were regarded as late imitations of the monumental structures of high cultures, for example, the pyramids in Egypt. It was generally believed that they were introduced by the first farmers who spread along the coast of the Atlantic, or that they were a manifestation of a new religion adopted by already existing farming societies in Western Europe. In Ireland, there are many different types of chamber tombs, such as dolmens, passage graves, stone circles, and portal dolmens. The latter belong to the most elegant Stone Age structures we know, as here at Poulnabrone in County Clare on the west coast. Stone-built monuments are found all over Ireland, with large concentrations above all in the northern parts. The graves on Moor, County Sligo, are proved to be among the oldest in the world. The earliest ones erected almost 7,000 years ago, 2,500 years before the pyramids of Egypt. From 1977 to 1982, a Swedish archaeological expedition revealed a rich Stone Age society, where the erection of chamber tombs was a central part of the ritual life. The early dates eliminate any introduction of the tradition from abroad. The reason why the people began to build the monuments must be sought in the local society and the people who lived here 7,000 years ago. But there were still many questions concerning the cemetery. As a rule, chamber tombs are found only in non-migratory populations, where they often serve as the graves and cultic places of a family. But there were no real farmers at all along the Irish Atlantic coast when the first monuments were built on Carramore. What kind of economy made this relatively permanent form of life possible that early? To be able to answer this question, we had to find their settlements. Much of the grave inventory indicated that hunting and marine catches were of great importance to the economy of the megalith builders. The search was therefore concentrated to the coastline south of the cemetery. Along the coast of Ballysidar Bay, the expedition found a system of kitchen middens and deposits of remains of sea life. These mainly included oysters, but also common sea mussels and other mollusks that had been used as food by the people for a long time, even as late as Iron Age. The deep layers of shell were deposited over thousands of years, and the stratification is a detailed reference book of the way of life from the earlier Stone Age in the area. Bones of cattle were found only in the upper layers. It was thus the resources of the sea that made it possible for the people of Carramore to develop a high cultural tradition so early. Catching from the sea, combined with big game hunting, the gathering of wild vegetables and fishing in the rivers nearby, created an abundantly rich economic lifestyle for the early megalith builders. The River Gavauge, which rushes through the town of Sligo, only a mile from Carramore, still abounds with salmon. The situation on Carramore was in no way unique in Western Europe. Today we know that the idea of building chamber tombs was born in fishing and early farming societies in many coastal regions along the Atlantic coast during the 5th millennium BC. The reasons for this must be sought in the lifestyle and circumstances of the societies living in very barren areas where hunter-gatherers were of crucial importance. In the Orkney Islands in northern Scotland is another striking example of this art survival, on a high level of culture during the Stone Age and with a rich ritual and ceremonial life. The fact that the monuments are so well preserved has given us a remarkable insight into the everyday life of the megalith builders. The Ring of Brogar is one of the most impressive stone circles of megalithic Europe. The monument is evidence of a firm system and ranking order of the Stone Age society on Orkney during Neolithic times, at least as far as the religious and ceremonial needs of humans are concerned. Perhaps astronomical observations were part of the cult, just as they were at Stonehenge and other places. The open-air temple was probably used in common by many settlements along the coasts. In 1850, violent winter storms and waves swept over the Orkney Islands to reveal the well-preserved remains of a megalithic Stone Age village, which is still today unparalleled in Europe. A sandhill on the east side of the Bay of Scale, known as Skara Brae on the main island, was partly washed out into the sea, and a sensational find revealed. In the middle of a huge kitchen midden, parts of 6 stone-built houses with connecting passages were exposed. Excavations showed that the entire village was buried in a kitchen midden, an enormous refuse mound consisting of shells of oysters and mussels, closely packed together and mixed with clay, ashes and bones. The original refuse heap was much older than the stone-built houses, and the intention of placing them like that was to protect the buildings from the relentless winter storms of the Atlantic. The first settlement at Skara Brae can be dated back to about 3100 BC. The ruins of the Scarabray settlement, so well preserved, one more or less expects the inhabitants to return from their daily fishing trip, throw their catch to a corner house, and begin to make a fire in the big rectangular fireplace at any moment. Lack of timber forced the builders to also use stone in the interior of houses. The everyday life of the inhabitants more than 5,000 years ago has literally been petrified and preserved in a way that nothing corresponding to it in the European Stone Age. The 2.5-meter high walls are intact. The roofs of the houses were probably made of organic materials, dome-shaped and covered with turf, reed or hides. The most remarkable finds, though, are the totally undamaged pieces of furniture in the houses: fireplaces, beds, alcoves and high wall cupboards or shelves on the long walls of all the houses. Let us now go to the European continent. History seems to stand still at Santiago de Compostela, the medieval capital of Galicia in northwest Spain. Yet the cultural traditions of the region are much older than the well-known and holy destination of the Christian pilgrims. Here too, the people of Stone Age began early to build chamber tombs over dead, and the mysterious megaliths are integrated in a remarkable way into the monuments of recent times. It's obvious that marine resources were of great importance to the economy of the megalith builders then as well as today. Like here at the small fishing village of Coribuedo, just west of Santiago. And along the coast, magnificent graves are at rest, linking the present with the past. In Portugal, the megalithic civilization developed during the Stone Age not only along the Atlantic coast, but also along the big rivers flowing through pasture land and traditional farming districts. The most important region is along the River Douro, near the town of Viseu. Many of the Portuguese chamber tombs have surprisingly well-preserved paintings. The famous dolmen of Antilles, not far from Viseu, has elegant geometric patterns in red and black, magic symbols whose meaning was lost to us long ago. This long passage grave is situated at Cuca de Bigso. It was built by a strange way of slanting stone blocks, closely put together in the chamber and along the long passage. Irrespective of where we go along the Atlantic coast of Europe, we meet the same development of a megalithic tradition in the Stone Age societies more than 5,000 years ago, of Spain, Portugal, France, and Holland. It may be difficult to imagine what the landscape of the Stone Age looked like in what today are picturesque towns with networks of canals. Today's Amsterdam was once rich swamps abounding in fish, birds and big game, the landscape of the megaliths. And passage graves of the region of Drenthe in Holland are among the most impressive chamber tombs ever built, as here at Borga near Assen. The megalithic tradition in northern Europe began in most cases more than 1,000 years later than in Ireland and in France. It was therefore to develop into typical farming societies where cattle breeding was the main occupation and source of income. The expansion of farming and more permanent settlements increased competition and aggression between different tribes. It's no accident, therefore, that the first evidence of human sacrifices and cannibalism in northern Europe is linked to the megalithic culture. The Danish farm landscape with its half-timbered houses has a tradition which is 6,000 years old. As early as the Stone Age, painted longhouses of wattle and daub were built, where humans and animals lived together under the same roof. And for the same reason, we find chamber tombs spread over what is now one of the world's most cultivated regions. A small island in southern Denmark, there are large concentrations of dolmens and passage graves, for instance, Als and Langeland. Kong Humbers Grav, the famous long barrow on Langeland, today in the middle of a field, was surrounded with lush pasture land some 5,000 years ago. The distinctive northern boundary of the chamber tomb tradition during the Neolithic period in Europe is to be found in the province of Bohuslän in Sweden. But whereas most of the Swedish megalithic graves are situated in the farming and cattle breeding regions of Stone Age, just as in Denmark, the dolmens in Bohuslän are built near the coast, and most of them were built close to the coastline of the Stone Age. The welfare of the community always varied with the local conditions, and for the people on the Swedish west coast, fishing and marine catches have always been the basis of their economy. The megalith builders of the Stone Age were no exception. Today, we know far more about the Neolithic period and the ceremonial function of the European chamber tombs, but we still know little or nothing about the real background of the monuments. Why were they built? What real function in the societies they served? Were they just places where the dead were buried, or did they in reality symbolize the kingdom of the dead? What was the function of the astronomical observations in the cult? A phenomenon that is so clearly manifested in so many stone-built monuments. Why are the megalithic graves situated almost exclusively along the Atlantic coast of Western Europe? Were they territorial markings between competing societies? Questions are endless, but we have nobody to ask. The links to such traditions were cut off thousands of years ago. We must look for the answers on the other side of the world. The custom of building stone monuments has existed in many parts of the world. Especially in Southeast Asia and the Pacific area, many different societies have developed various forms of megalithic traditions over thousands of years. In several places, these customs still live on. The Indonesian archipelago is one such place. The island of Celebes, today called Sulawesi, was discovered by the Portuguese in 1511, when they were trying to monopolize the spice trade with the Moluccas. A series of shipwrecks on the northern coast gave the island its name, Ponto dos Celebes, the notorious Cape. The island is famous for its outstanding boat builders and seafarers, the Buginese, who lived in the coastal area in the south for more than 1,000 years. From their hometown, Makassar, they have skillfully sailed their slender vessels with raised stems and broad, squarely cut sterns for centuries. These legendary vessels, or prahu, are still made in the same place, which is today the modern capital of Sulawesi, Ujung Pandang. The town is still the center of this shipping across the Indian Ocean to Madagascar in the west, to Australia in the south, and to China in the north. The Black Sea cucumber, trepang, has always been an important part of the trade with the East Asian countries. Fort Rotterdam, built by Portuguese in the 1660s and which now contains the Provincial Museum of Ujung Pandang, is one of the best examples of Dutch architecture in Indonesia. The Sultan of Makassar, the ruler of the country of Goa on southern Sulawesi, favoured the Portuguese and English, which greatly annoyed the Dutch. So in 1607, a series of confrontations with the Sultanate began. The Dutch finally crushed the mighty Goa under Sultan Hasanuddin after hard resistance. The megalithic cultural traditions in Indonesia are spread over many islands. On many of them, the cult is still practiced in its original form, and on 3 of them, the erection of stone monuments is the most central part of ceremonial life. In the central highlands of Sulawesi, we meet the Toraja people, who have one of the most spectacular cultural traditions in the world. An amazing sight. The distant blue Nona Mountains form a beautiful panorama at the gate of Tanah Toraja, the Shangri-La of Sulawesi. The Toraja people call the place Bamba Buang, God's neighbor. The steep mountain slopes are dominated by well-built cultivation terraces. The wet rice is the most important source of nourishment, and the minutely well-kept rice plantations form softly rounded and intensely green sceneries in the fertile valleys. Everywhere in Toraja, impressive water buffaloes wallow in cool rivers and rice field canals. The buffalo is the foremost symbol of wealth and prosperity, and the animals are happily unconscious of their future bloody fate. They are cared for like princes in their lifetime. In Toraja, life is only a prelude to death. Tradition is intimately connected with conceptions of the life to come and with dead ancestors. The characteristic houses, or tongkonan, with their spectacular roofs stretching towards the sky, form a central part of the cosmos. The villages in well-ordered groups are like islands in an ocean of cultivated land. Here, the village of Palava and the roof constructions of the houses together create a completely unique composition of mythology, cosmology, and everyday life. Everything is interwoven and passed on through the ages by the priests. The sacrifice of water buffalo is a central part of the megalithic culture. Every stage of the building of a new tongkonan is connected with rites and ceremonies. The blood of the sacrificial animals is sprinkled on tools which are to be used, and the rows of bullhorns are memories of the ritual sacrifices made in connection with just this tongkonan, together with aluk, or cult signs, associated with either death or smoke. On the gables of the houses, there's always a protective wooden head of bull, or kabongyo. The word tongkonan is in fact 4 different meanings, all associated with the cycle of the seasons and the spirits of ancestors. The first one is the dwelling house itself, but tongkonan is also the name of the storehouses for the rice harvest, of the rock tombs in which the bones of the dead are kept, and of megalithic cult places. The Toraja do not build any megalithic tombs. Instead, they erect menhirs, standing stones which symbolize the spirits of the dead. The gigantic menhirs at Bori belong to the most impressive megalithic cultures in the whole region. The small stones beside the bigger ones indicate deceased children. It's interesting that the name of the foremost of the gods of the universe is the same as the word for a stone, Ranta. The erection of stones is thus intimately associated with the cult of ancestors and with mythological and cosmological conceptions. Caring for the dead is an extremely long process, which in fact never ends. Instead, it consists of a series of regulated stages in the relationship between the living and the dead. A dead person's situation and station in the kingdom of the dead, and his or her way there, is quite dependent on the family's ability to perform the necessary sacrifices and ceremonies. These are necessary to ensure the individual's access to the kingdom of the dead, known as Puya. The dead, or rather their washed bones, are placed in rock tombs, cut out deeply in the mountains. A small wooden door seals the tomb. A wooden figure representing the dead person, a tautau, is made, nearly lies, dressed in the dead person's clothes, and placed together with those of the earlier dead on a balcony, cut out high up on the rock wall, as here in the valley of Londa. In recurrent ceremonies, the dead person's bones are taken out to be washed and then wrapped in new woven fabrics. This usually happens at intervals of a few years. At Limo, groups of tautau with lifelike and lively faces stand looking out over the rice fields, their outstretched arms ready to receive the homage of the living. At the burial ground at Suwaya, we experienced the most remarkable contact with the dead. When wind makes their clothes move slowly, the figures with their intense eyes seem suddenly to come to life, and their hands seem to move in quiet gesture towards the observer on the ground below. The ghost-like atmosphere is intensified by the grey color given to the whole group by the limestone mountain behind it. Some of the oldest and best preserved wooden coffins are to be found at Hace. The burial ceremony culminates with the sacrifice of wood buffaloes, sometimes as many as 250 in a few days. The intentional destruction of wealth ensures access of the dead person's soul to the kingdom of the dead, or to Huya. The most sacred of all sacrifices, however, is the blood sacrifice. With a long knife, they slash the carotid and the throat of the animal, which bleeds to death in a few minutes. A liturgy is read, the sacrifice has been made, and the dead's soul can start its journey. Also on the island of Sumba, among the less Sandas in southern Indonesia, the sacrifice of water buffaloes plays a central part among the death rites. But there we meet quite a different megalithic tradition. On Sumba, no menhirs are erected. Instead, the dead are placed in megalithic tombs, primarily in dolmens. The tombs are built in large groups in the center of the villages. Every family owns one or more tombs, and the arrangement gives constant and close contact between the living and the dead in the everyday life of villages. Human sacrifices on megalithic altars were practiced until quite recently. Following raids on enemy villages, the decapitated heads of fallen enemies were stuck on wooden poles placed in the middle of the burial ground. Today, there are still constant tribal wars going on between these strongly fortified villages, and as a rule, they are fought on horseback. The megalithic villages on Sumba show an unbroken tradition with stone-built monuments unparalleled anywhere in the world. The great linguistic similarities between the different megalithic societies of Indonesia indicate a common area of origin of these stone-building traditions on the islands. And they also share another characteristic cultural trait which is unknown outside the region. The famous weaving technique, ikat, which includes a very complicated and time-consuming process of dyeing, where the whole pattern is colored into the warp before the real weaving is started. Ikat fabrics from Sumba are characterized by lively and colorful figure patterns, with human beings, animals, and mythological symbols. Most of the islands in southern Indonesia present more or less living megalithic traditions. Fishing and marine catches are often of great importance to the economy here, besides farming. Whale fishing on the island of Tanimbar is still a dangerous and unique method of survival. They still harpoon in the Stone Age way by throwing themselves with the harpoons onto the backs of whales, which are often much bigger than the boats. On the island of Savu, a different megalithic tradition has developed. For once, the women here play an important part in the cult ceremonies. The black round volcanic stones are part of a fertility rite. The women oil the stones to ensure high fertility. The richly varied megalithic traditions in the Indonesian archipelago are an infinite source of knowledge how these traditions may have developed in different directions, but where common traits are striking all the same. Ancestral worship is central, with sacrifices of food and drink to the spirits of their ancestors. The obvious pattern in megalithic Europe 5,000 years earlier is identical. In the 18th century, when J. Cook and other early travelers discovered the Stone Age cultures of the South Pacific, they met powerful chiefdoms with advanced megalithic traditions in most of the island states in the whole Pacific area. On Tonga Tapu, Kingdom of Tonga, big stone blocks were cut out of the coral reef, and there are still hundreds of half-finished blocks under the water along the coasts to be seen today. The families of the chiefs used these stones to build gigantic rectangular stone tombs, known as langi. The famous stone gate at Amonga, the Stonehenge of the South Pacific, is unique in the whole Pacific area. Thanks to Captain Cook, the megalithic tradition there is the best known in the whole of Polynesia. The center for the megalithic cult was the island of Raiatea. Also on other islands, important places had developed, like here on Huahina. The local name for these temples was marae, which were mainly used for ancestral cult ceremonies. However, a number of huge monuments were dedicated to the Polynesian wars, and on these there were often human sacrifices. Perhaps the most characteristic and certainly the best known megalithic tradition in the whole of the South Pacific is to be found on Easter Island. The Polynesians on Easter Island did not build any stone tombs. Instead, their altars or ahu were decorated with gigantic stone statues or moai, portraits of important ancestors. These ancestral sculptures were transported down from the quarry in the volcano of Ranuraroku to the coast, where they were erected on platforms with their backs turned to the sea. Eyes of white coral stone were placed in their eye sockets to give life to their figures. For some strange reason, a large number of figures were left on the slopes of the volcano, halfway down to their final position, as if the tradition had suddenly come to a dramatic end. Also in the Hawaiian Islands, megalithic temples were erected for the cult of the spirits of their ancestors and to the most important gods, like Puanoa Ohonono on the big island of Hawaii. Grotesque idols of wood adorn these holy places. One of the most enigmatic cult centers we know in the South Pacific is Nan Madol on Ponape in Micronesia. Built on artificial platforms in the sea, 92 temples stand surrounded by peaceful canals, evidence of a powerful chiefdom and an advanced ceremonial system which disappeared long ago. Some of the most original Stone Age traditions are still to be found in the Melanesian archipelago in the West Pacific Ocean. Among these are the islands of Vanuatu, charted in 1774 by Captain James Cook and then named the New Hebrides. In Vanuatu, there is literally a stone's throw between the Stone Age and present times, on islands like Malakula, Ambri, Pentecost, Espiritu Santo, and Aievo. From the modern capital, Port Vila, on the island of Ifate, it's only 1 hour's flight to the northern islands, where cultural traditions many thousands of years old still live on, unaffected in many places. In inaccessible mountain regions on southern Malakula, an earlier, quite unknown tribe was discovered as recently as 5 years ago. Many of these societies have developed different kinds of megalithic traditions. Dressed in their traditional nambas, The men performed the ceremonies in special dancing grounds in front of stone-built tombs and altars, as here in the village of Fanla on Ambrim. The megalithic tradition on Malekula is concentrated along the coastline of the island. It lives on especially in the northernmost of these small border islands, on Val. Big Nambas, the most feared and warlike cannibals in the whole of Melanesia up to modern times, have lived in constant conflict with megalith builders along the coast. From their homeland at the head village of Amok, they made constant raids of surrounding tribes, and few white people dared to enter their territory at all. Big Nambas have a number of peculiar cultural traditions. The women's fate is to have their front teeth knocked out, the most coveted favour a woman can get. Another remarkable custom is institutionalized homosexuality among men during young boys' adolescence. The women's hair decorations and the men's bark belts are the same as when Cook described them more than 200 years ago. Current wars decimated the big numbers, so today there are only isolated groups left. Most of them have moved down towards the coasts and their ancient enemies. After Captain Cook, it was to take 150 years before any European studied the remarkable cultural traditions on the island. And then it was to be two ethnographers from Cambridge in England, almost at the same time, John Layard in 1914 and Arthur Bernard Deacon in 1926. Thanks to the French journalist and documentary filmmaker Gilles Latour and his friendship with the Big Nambas, we also have unique documents of the Big Nambas' peculiar culture. In 1953, he visited Malekula and filmed the most important of their ceremonies, Namaki, performed when somebody enters a higher rank in society and to mark the importance of the succession of the chiefs. In 1980, Gilles Latour returned to film the same ceremony and found that nothing had changed. The whole traditional social system of Malekula is built around the order of precedence of individuals, which governs their social, economic and religious order. The institution is called Nimanki, or only Maki, by Big Nambas Namaki. It consists of different ranks, in certain societies as many as 30. It is characteristic of the system that the erection of megalithic monuments is, as a rule, included in reaching the highest ranks, and that the sacrifice of pigs near erected stones symbolize direct contact with the spirits of the ancestors. The word Amaki simply means the killing pigs near the stone in which the spirit lives. But even if erect stones are a central part of their world of conceptions, Big Nambas never buried their dead in megalithic tombs. To find this custom, must go to the northeast coast of Malekula. On the small coral island of Val, every village still has its own megalithic dancing ground, which serves as both a ceremonial and a burial ground. These are Petahul, Tolamp Tugvanu, Petaihi, Patig, Venu, Norahura, and Singon. A stretch of shark-infested water lies between the northeast coast of Malekula and Wau and other border islands of Achin, Va, Rano, Norsop, Uripib, and Uri. According to legend, there was once another island which disappeared during a catastrophe. This was Tolamp. The inhabitants fled to the coast of Malekula, where they built a new settlement and dancing ground with the same name. Hostilities with surrounding tribes, however, forced the Tolamp Islanders to seek refuge on Val, but today they share the dancing ground with the village of Tolvanu. When the slip drums sound in the jungle night, it's the spirits of their ancestors that speak. Kirk Huffman, the head of Vanuatu's Museum and Cultural Centre at Port Vila, is the leading expert on the culture and traditions of Malekula.
The first European scientist to study megalithic traditions here on Malekula properly was the Cambridge anthropologist Dr. John Layard, who spent the years 1914 and 1915 here in northeast Malekula. and produce one of the classics but lesser known, one of the classic but lesser known texts of the anthropological world, a book called Stone Man of Malekula, published in London in 1942. When John Layard was here, the megalithic tradition was still in full swing. His major informant on the small island here of Vau was a man called Mataru from this dancing ground here, Togvan. And today, also in this dancing ground, is Mataru's son, Olfala Bartali. The megalithic tradition here in northeast Malekula still continues in a slightly modified form. The 6 villages here on Vau still have their dancing grounds. This Netsara, dancing ground Togvanu, is a double Netsara. It's linked with Tolamp. It's Togvanu Tolamp. Tolamp, referring to the sunken island of Tolamp that used to exist maybe up to about 300 years ago, in between this island of Vau and the island of Hace to the south.
By outrigged canoe, we paddle over to Vau. Much has changed since Layard was here almost 75 years ago. The canoes lie on Colville Beach, their bows decorated with birds to give magic and protective powers. Martin Johnson, the American big game hunter, globetrotter, writer and filmmaker, visited Malekula on several occasions during 1917 to 1919, and many of his film sequences are unique documents, which are roughly contemporary with Layard's fieldwork. Here, the skulls of deceased ancestors are smoked. They are then kept in the houses, a tradition that is maintained today only in the isolated mountain areas of Malekula. Human sacrifices and cannibalism were very common up to the 1930s, and many struggles were fought here on Colville Beach. Across the sound from Vau is Tolamp on Malekula, where the inhabitants of the sunken island settled after the disaster and where they still live today. The dancing ground on the main island is the only one of its kind, otherwise only found on the border islands in the northeast. On the Netsara at Tolamp, we meet old Matu's son, Massa, with his children and grandchildren. The gigantic stone erected behind the dancing ground is the biggest known on Malekula, and the cult around it was described in detail by Layard. A snake, the symbol of the tribe, is painted on one of the big wooden drums. Massan tells us the background of the stone and how his tribe adopted the snake as its symbol. A girl from Bodnangao was married to a man from Tolamp whose name was Tiki Tiki, but the girl was not old enough to have a child. One day, however, she was bitten by a snake and the snake made her pregnant. We therefore got our lineal descent from the snake, so we thus have the right to use it as a symbol on our Netsara. Let's return to the tiny island of Vau. Behind Colville Beach is a secluded megalithic village which has strongly opposed every outside influence on the traditional social system with the cult of ancestors and the important pig ceremonies at stone chamber monuments. The name of the village is Venu, and the chief, Bani Meltegungi, emphatically explains what a threat the Christian missionary work, for instance, is to the continued existence of his society and its ancient customs. Bani Rungi wears the men's traditional dress, the Namba. And before our interview with him, Kirk Huffman explains that what is unique about this village is that it still maintains its prehistoric traditions and has managed to resist all forms of Western influence. And he also tells us that in our cold part of the world, very long ago, we too built stone monuments and stone rows of the same kind as they still do in Bennu. We are proud of our customs. From time immemorial, our society has functioned well with its customs. We respect each other and the spirits of our ancestors, and our customs appease the spirits. We have fish in the sea and good crops. Why should your gods be better for us? Our gods have always been good. Why should we change our customs? Look what happened when some of the villages here were christened. Respect for our old customs died for all time. They go to church on Sundays, but during the rest of the week, the young people do nothing but just drink beer. Many move to Efata to get jobs, so they can buy more beer and radio sets. Such things do not happen in our village. Here, all of us work for our own welfare. After our long journey around the world, we can safely claim while walking around the holy dancing grounds on Vau that we have met megalith builders in a large number of different societies with a remarkable extension in time and space. Between the Karamo people in Ireland of the Stone Age and today's stonemen in Indonesia and Vanuatu, there is a time gap of almost 7,000 years. During this long span of time, the same types of monuments have been built in highly different societies with strongly varying economic and religious systems. The cultural variety seems to be infinite, but the common traits are also obvious. The jaws of sacrificial pigs on the stone altars of Vau mark again the importance of blood sacrifices in megalith cult. In Melanesia, pigs. In Indonesia, buffaloes. And, just as in the Stone Age of Europe, human sacrifices were once the optimal sacrificial ritual to appease the spirits of ancestors. And it is just the cult of the ancestors that is the central part of most megalithic ceremonies. The stone men on the dancing ground in the village of Norora on Vau gaze with personal expressions at the onlooker. They are the abodes of ancestors and masters of the elements. There is no megalithic society where every individual has the right to erect a stone or build a chamber tomb. Most people never obtain it. Right is always intimately connected with status and rank, inherited or acquired. A monument marks individual station and the importance of the line of descent. But everything is related to the life to come and to the ancestors you will meet in the kingdom of the dead. Human attitudes to the thought and need for erecting megalithic monuments seem very similar, independent of where we are and in what time. This inspires us with great hope of finding the solution to one of the oldest and most fascinating mysteries in modern archaeology.